The ship didn't sink. It just never arrived. Because it was never supposed to. In the autumn of 1856, the Caldera left the coast under clear conditions. No storm, no warning, nothing that would explain what happened next. The route was simple, a short passage along the Gulf, 3 days at most. Routine, predictable, forgettable. Which is exactly what made it perfect. The vessel itself was unremarkable. Weathered timber, reinforced hull, built not for speed, but for capacity. Below deck, the cargo was secured, counted, documented. 200 individuals, not named, not recorded beyond numbers, not expected to be remembered. Above them, everything appeared normal. Crew at their stations, orders given, course set, nothing out of place, nothing that would suggest deviation. But course is not always what is written. Sometimes it is what is decided. Captain Elias Vance had sailed that route before, more than once. He knew the waters, the currents, the timing. He knew exactly how long it would take for anyone to start asking questions. And more importantly, how long it would take before anyone cared enough to look. The departure log was signed, the cargo verified, everything accounted for. On paper, the journey had already been completed, before it even began. That was the first detail no one noticed, not at the harbor, not at the office, not even among those who would later review the records, because everything looked correct. And when things look correct, they are rarely questioned. The Caldera moved steadily along the coastline, sails full, course true. At least, that's what anyone watching from shore would have believed. But distance hides intention, and once the coastline disappeared, so did certainty. Something changed out there, not suddenly, not visibly, just enough to alter direction, not toward the destination, but away from it. No signal was sent, no report was filed, because none was required. There was no emergency, no mistake, no accident, only a decision. Deck. The people held there would not have known, not at first. There are no windows in darkness, no horizon to measure. Only time, and time can be controlled. Meals given at intervals, movement restricted, light limited. Everything designed to remove reference, to erase awareness, to make direction irrelevant. Because once you cannot tell where you are going, you cannot tell that you are no longer going where you were promised. Above deck, the crew followed orders, adjusted sails, shifted course. No questions asked, because questions require context, and context had already been removed. The Caldera did not disappear. It did exactly what it was meant to do. It left. It traveled. And then it went somewhere no one was meant to trace. Days passed, then more. No arrival, no message, no sign. At first, no one noticed, because delays were expected, routes were long, and absence was not unusual. Not yet. But somewhere along that coast, in a place not marked on official routes, something else was waiting, prepared, hidden, ready to receive what was never meant to arrive. And by the time anyone began to ask where the ship had gone, the answer was already buried. Because this was never a disappearance. It was a transfer, a controlled vanishing. At first, no one called it disappearance. They called it delay, the kind that happens at sea. Winds shift. Currents slow a vessel down. Schedules slip. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth concern. The Caldera was expected within 3 days. On the 4th, there were no alarms. On the 5th, a note was made. Overdue. Not missing. Not lost. Just late. Because ships did not simply vanish. Not on that route. Not under those conditions. And certainly not one that had left under clear skies, with no sign of trouble. By the end of the week, questions began to surface. Quietly. Controlled. Directed towards schedules, logs, expected arrivals. Not toward possibility. Because possibility can create panic. And panic is harder to contain than absence. The harbor office reviewed the departure record. Everything was in order. Cargo accounted for. Crew listed. Route confirmed. Nothing missing. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained anything. So they looked outward. Other vessels. Other routes. Anything that might have crossed paths with the Caldera. But no one had seen it. Not after it left. No passing ships. No signals. No debris. No wreckage. Nothing. And that was the first real problem. Because when something is lost at sea, it leaves something behind. Wood. Sails. Fragments. Evidence that something happened. Something visible. But here, there was nothing to point to. Nothing to follow. Nothing to explain. So the explanation came anyway. Storm. Unrecorded. Unseen. A sudden shift in weather. Strong enough to take a vessel down. Without warning. Without trace. It was written. Filed. Accepted. Because it had to be. Because something needed to exist where nothing could be found. And once it was written, it became truth. Not because it was proven, but because it was recorded. The Caldera was declared lost. The cargo, gone. The crew, gone. Everything accounted for. In absence. And with that, the process moved forward. Claims were filed. Compensation calculated. Numbers assigned to what could no longer be seen. Because loss is easier to manage when it can be measured. Converted. Closed. And for most, that was enough. The records existed. The explanation was accepted. The event was finished. But not for everyone. Because there are always those who notice what isn't there. Not what is missing, but what should be. The absence of wreckage. The absence of signals. The absence of any attempt to find what was lost. Those absences do not behave like accidents. They behave like intention. And once that thought appears, it does not leave. Because if this was not a storm, then it was something else. Something planned. Something controlled. Something that required no witnesses. No trace. No return. And that possibility was far more dangerous than any storm. Because storms are beyond control. But this suggested someone had it. And if someone controlled it, then the Caldera had not been lost. It had been taken, not by chance, but by design. Which meant, somewhere out there, it had arrived, just not where it was supposed to. The first sign did not come from the sea. It came from land. Weeks after the Caldera was declared lost, a man appeared along the outer edge of the coast. Not in the port, not in any place that kept records, but further inland, where oversight thinned. He did not arrive with ceremony, no announcement, no documentation, just presence. And presence is often enough. His name was Elias Vance, or at least that was the name he used. No one questioned it, because men like him did not invite questions. They replaced them. Land was acquired quickly, quietly, signed without hesitation. A stretch of ground near the coast, but not visible from the main routes. Not easily accessed, not easily observed. Construction began within days. Not a house, not exactly. Something lower, heavier, built partially into the earth itself. Stone, timber, reinforced, as if it were meant to hold something, rather than protect it. As if it were designed to keep things in. The workers were temporary, brought in, paid, dismissed. No one stayed long enough to understand what they were building, because understanding requires time, and time was controlled. The structure grew quickly, hidden by trees, positioned away from view, blending into the land, as if it had always been there. But what stood out was not the building. It was the timing. Too precise, too aligned. A ship disappears. No wreckage, no trace. And within weeks, something appears. Built to contain, built to isolate, built with purpose. The locals noticed. Of course they did. Not everything, but enough. They saw the movement, the supplies, the men coming and going, the way no one was allowed too close. But noticing is not the same as acting, because acting requires certainty, and certainty was not something they had. Only fragments, only patterns, only a feeling that something did not belong. And then there were sounds, not loud, distinct, but present. At night, carried faintly on the wind, too irregular to ignore, too unclear to define. Some said it was machinery, others that it was movement. But no one said more than that, because saying more would mean acknowledging something else, something no one wanted to consider. That whatever had been lost at sea had not been lost at all. It had been brought here. Elias Vance did not explain himself. He did not need to. He moved through the site with quiet authority, issuing instructions, adjusting details, always present, always in control, as if everything unfolding there had already been decided long before the ship ever left the harbor. Because plans like this do not begin at sea. They begin long before departure, long before anyone is counted, long before anyone realizes they are part of it. And now the pieces were aligning. A ship that never arrived, a structure built in silence, a man with no past appearing at exactly the right moment. Not coincidence, not misfortune, not accident. Something else. Something constructed, deliberate. And once that idea takes hold, everything begins to look different. Because the question is no longer, where did the ship go? It becomes, what was waiting for it when it got there? By the time the structure was complete, it no longer looked temporary. It looked permanent. Not something built for a moment, but something built to continue. From the outside, it revealed almost nothing. Low profile, hidden angles, no windows, no visible entry beyond a single reinforced door. But below ground, it extended further than anyone expected. Rooms, passages, divided spaces, designed with intention. Not for comfort, for containment. Everything inside followed a pattern. Measured distances, controlled access, movement limited, sound reduced, light restricted. Not enough to disorient completely, but enough to remove certainty. Because certainty is what allows people to understand where they are. And once that is gone, so is resistance. That was the design. Not chaos, not brutality. Control. Precise. Consistent. Invisible from the outside. Above ground, nothing appeared unusual. Supplies arrived in intervals, scheduled, unremarkable. Water, food, materials. Enough to sustain, but never enough to create independence. Because independence would break the system, and this system was not meant to break. Elias Vance moved through it as if it had always existed, as if he had always known exactly how it would function, where people would be placed, how long they would remain, what they would be allowed to see, and more importantly, what they would not. Because limitation is easier to maintain when it is never fully understood. The people brought there would not have known where they had arrived. No landmarks, no reference, no sense of direction. Only routine, repetition, control. Days structured, movement restricted, interaction limited. Everything designed to replace awareness with dependence. Because once dependence is established, control no longer needs to be enforced. It becomes expected, accepted, and eventually invisible, even to those living inside it. That was the real purpose of the operation, not just relocation, not just concealment, but transformation. Taking people from one system and placing them into another, where the rules could be rewritten, without interruption, without oversight, without history. Because history requires records, and records require visibility. But here, nothing was recorded. Nothing was meant to be found. Nothing was meant to exist outside of this place, which made it perfect. Not for survival, but for erasure. Above ground, the world continued. The Caldera was gone, declared lost, accounted for in absence. And with that, everything below remained hidden, protected not by walls, but by belief. Because once something is believed to be gone, no one looks for it. And if no one looks, it may as well never have existed at all. That was the final layer. Not the structure, not the system, but the story. A disappearance that ensured no one would ever search for what had arrived. A loss that protected what had been built perfectly. Because the most effective way to hide something is not to conceal it. It is to convince the world that it is already gone. In the end, there was no investigation. Not a real one. Not the kind that looks for answers. Only the kind that confirms them. The Caldera was recorded as lost, a maritime failure, an unfortunate event. Closed, filed, final. And once something is written that way, it becomes difficult to change. Not because the truth is unknown, but because the truth no longer matters. Records replaced reality. Paper replaced memory. And what could not be proven was no longer considered, which meant everything that followed could continue without interruption, without question, without consequence. The structure remained, hidden, unlisted, not on any map, not in any ledger, not acknowledged by any authority, but still there, still functioning, still active. Because systems like that do not end when they are discovered. They end only when they are exposed. And this one never was. There were attempts, whispers, fragments of accounts, people who noticed the inconsistencies, who questioned the absence, who asked why nothing had ever been found. But questions without evidence do not survive. They fade, dismissed, replaced by what is easier to accept. A storm, a loss, a story that requires no further thought. And over time, even the questions disappeared. Because memory is not permanent. It shifts, it softens, until what remains is only what was allowed to stay, not what was true. Elias Vance was never formally connected. No record tied him to the vessel. No document placed him on that route. No proof confirmed his role. Only timing. Only alignment. Only the quiet certainty that everything had happened exactly as intended. And that is what made it untouchable. Because without proof, there is nothing to confront, nothing to dismantle, nothing to stop. So it continued, quietly, unseen, operating beneath the surface of a world that believed it had already moved on. The Caldera was not the first, and it was not the last. And it was not the last. It was simply the one that almost left a trace. Almost. But not enough. Because in the end, what disappears is not always gone. Sometimes it has just been moved, replaced, rewritten, removed from the version of events that people are allowed to see. And that difference between what happened and what is remembered is where stories like this survive. Not in records, not in official history, but in the gaps, in the inconsistencies, in the details, that never quite align and never fully disappear. Because once something is designed to vanish perfectly, the only trace it leaves behind is the question it creates. What really happened out there? And more importantly, how many times has it happened since?